Thanks again, guys, for joining yet another amazing episode of the Proudly Made in Africa podcast. Today we have Mr. Francis Agbere with us, joining us all the way from Oxfam. So thank you, Francis, for joining us today on this episode. How you
Thanks,
doing?
Mavrik, for having me on the show.
Awesome. How's your day going over there? Good?
It's going is lovely. It's quite a fair weather, and
Yeah,
we can't complain about it.
I love that. I love that. So I've been doing some, dabbling here and there about, the progress Oxfam has been making within the continent of Africa itself. And I stumbled into this initiative. So it's the CAADP one. And for people who might not, have any idea about all this, let's start from a good baseline. So if you don't mind going through what it is and what is its goal right now?
Yes, thanks again for that. Uh,
Problem.
for colleagues who have no idea what the CAADP is, it's an acronym for the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, which essentially is a blueprint that Africa came up with roughly 20 years ago to sort of lay out the broad anchors of how it intends to deal with the crisis of food security, but generally, in a much more broader sense, food systems. And this was something that uh, the heads of state thought through and figured that, well, if Africa needed to scale its economic priorities, it needed to look closely at how the agriculture sector is playing out in the face of growing inequality, which we have demonstrated as Oxfam to be one of the overriding challenges that we face on the continent. So that is what it stands for. Uh, in terms of the different pillars, if I'll put it that way, of the framework, you have priorities that are looking at access to markets. You're looking also at priorities that are considering the role of research, right? To be able to feed into the food systems using new evidence, using innovation and knowledge that will build in to enhance agriculture. You also have priorities on sustainable water and land management, amongst a host of others. So essentially, that is what the CAADP is, and in short, industry players call that CAADP
Kind
for
of
short,
question.
CAADP, right?
Nice. And what's the relationship with Oxfam? How does Oxfam play a role in all of this?
Yes, I think first and foremost, it's important for us to understand the kind of context where we find ourselves in and where Oxfam fits. If you look across the continent, we're dealing with about 33 million smallholder farms, right? And these farms are responsible for basically providing up to 70% of the food supply of Africa. At the same time, Africa has been facing a hunger crisis. Roughly 38% of the population is struggling with hunger. And we recognize that these issues, amongst a host of others, such as the rising climate crisis, what we also find as really crucial to our work, the inequality crisis, where we demonstrate that it's just about seven richest African people who own uh, more wealth than half of the population. And I'm talking about 18% of the world's population, because that's what Africa's population uh, forms a share of the bigger population pie, if I'll put it that way. So, all of these issues raise a very important question to us as Oxfam, particularly in respect of our food systems work. And so we thought that such a framework is essential for us to really engage, and to engage in which ways? To engage, one, by ensuring that smallholder farmers are able to find space within this framework, both to be able to ensure that they're able to raise productivity as a starting point, but are able to reflect their voices in respect of the challenges they face around low pricing for commodities, the challenges they face around land tenure systems, the challenges that rural women farmers face amidst all of these critical issues. And that is the central theme of our work in respect of food systems. Basically, to push governments, to push policy, to push the boundaries of thinking, of thought, basically, around reforming the system in a way that puts the smallholder farmer at the heart of it to be able to gain as much value as possible. And that is why the CAADP was one instrument through which we engage very closely.
Okay. And if I'm looking at maybe some real world examples of, the impact of this strategy in the past 2 decades, do you have any ones that you can share with us that, okay, this is some of the things that has happened in this area, and including the industries within the agricultural landscape that has been affected positively?
It's a number of things, and I'll say that uh, to kind of start this conversation, it's important to appreciate what really were the milestones that were set,
Okay.
under the CAADP framework. Part of the recognition, and I think this is a critical aspect of the CAADP framework, was that we weren't doing too much as Africa around investing through a public budget into the sector. And so, what the heads of states did was to commit to investing up to 10% of the public budget into the agriculture sector within the period uh, from 2003 all the way to 2025, which is next year when the framework basically runs its course. There are also other commitments, really, to ensure that up to 20% of the share of rural women farmers, were empowered within the agriculture sector. There are a host of others that were set. So if I were brief, just to highlight some of these key milestones, but so far, how has it been, in respect of these? And I'll mention a couple of others as well, some of which relate to the application of fertilizer in farms and so on and so forth. So let me start with the percentage investments in public budgets. That's the 10% commitment, what we call the uh, Malabo Declaration. If you do a small analysis, and the latest of such was released, I think, February this year, what you find is that there's been pockets of progress, right, uh, in respect of the commitment of budget. The performance hasn't been good because if you drill deeper into the data, you realize that no country really met this target, but there have been efforts that have been made. So countries like Rwanda have done quite extremely well, in terms of the resources that they commit from their budgets year on year into the agriculture sector. If you also look at the likes of Egypt, the likes of Ethiopia, they've done, quite well. Okay. In the case of Ghana, for instance, you're doing roughly 2% of budget relative to the initial target, which isn't so good, but I think somehow there's a bit of progress around that. So, in respect of public budget investment, that hasn't been as progressive as we had wanted it. What we have done as Oxfam has been to track these in national budgets because the implementation of this target was at country level to track and to sort of engage state authorities prior to budgeting processes, during budgeting processes, and post budgeting processes uh, to put their feet to fire, basically, around the fact that this commitment was made, and therefore we really need to do a lot around that over the past few years. What we have also been able to do as Oxfam, working closely with other civil society organizations under a framework that has been set up as part of the CAADP processes, what we call the CAADP non-state actor group, uh, was to see how We're able to work with allies to create the platform for civil society organizations, for smallholder farmer groups, or farmer-based associations to connect and to maintain the pressure on governments, on members of parliament, and so on, who vote these kinds of resources technically, at national level. So yeah, I'll say, whilst we haven't as Africa met that target, there have been pockets of progress in many places, and that is a starting point. Secondly, um, in respect of the proportion of rural women farmers who have been empowered really to overcome the challenges of the market, right? Being able to access the market with their with their produce, being able to navigate the challenges around policy barriers to land ownership and access. Countries like Ghana have done quite significantly. If you look at the last review, like I said, which was in February, there was quite uh, a significant performance from Ghana, from countries like Ethiopia, from countries like Egypt, and so on and so forth, uh, in how they have been able to empower uh, rural smallholder farmers to navigate these kinds of challenges. Yeah.
Would you say the distribution of efforts in terms of how the funds are being utilized is well distributed? So we talk about Ghana bringing in their own part of their budget, Egypt, Ethiopia, right? But I'm thinking we have 54 countries in Africa. I read recently about 10 more countries joined. So my question is, the likes of Nigeria's budget might be so much more compared to another country. If they're dropping 10%, is there, obviously it's not going to be a metric where they say, oh, you bring $1 million and you bring $1 million and we have equality. It's more like, if your budget is 200 million, 10% of your budget is maybe 20 million, and you know what I mean. So is there any strategy in that way that the budget they're bringing out is bringing back value into their country, or is it just a generalized bank where everybody brings 10% regardless, and then we spread it based on the strategy? How does it work?
Basically, how it operates is such that uh, the the commitment to really execute this was mainly laid through what they call the national agriculture investment plans, right? And I think at least 31 countries, at the last review, had such plans in place and were executing these. So basically, this is more at a national level where you look at the share of your budget, you know, and then how much of that, per the metrics that have been laid out, should go into the agriculture sector. So it wasn't, and the structure isn't such that country A, B, C, D puts money into a fund and then it's
Yeah,
spread even. Uh,
yeah.
it was basically telling countries that, well, based on these commitments that heads of states have made um, in your country, uh, you would, of course, look at your budget and then you would invest this share. That should amount to 10%.
Do they have, does this initiative have representatives that ensure regulations, transparency, and the likes? Because we still know how Africa work, where the budget disbursement is a different story. You can go into agriculture, but is it really getting to the hands of the people it should get to? So I'm curious about that part. Is there really transparency and accountability in that section?
Yes, I think this is a very important point that you have raised, uh, leading us to a space where we are asking questions around the actuals versus the allocations. And that for me is where, importantly, the question of dealing with, the inequalities of distribution of rents, the inequalities of targeting and what have you, comes into the picture. What we have been doing over the years, and as you probably note, is we recognize, and as I had highlighted per the data I shared earlier, that For us to be able to, transform our economies as Africa using the agriculture sector, we must recognize that these realities are there, that we have a situation where, whilst within a certain value chain, okay, you have different producers. Oftentimes, women are more, faced with such precarity of challenges, right? And I had mentioned a couple on land access and ownership, a couple also on access to markets, and even credit, and so on and so forth. So, our push has been, how do we ensure that uh, not only are budgets gender responsive, right? Recognizing that these imbalances exist within the value chains, but they should also be spent responsive from a gender perspective. So we started across a continuum from the budgeting level. We are pushing governments around ensuring that existing structure is laid out such that when you are allocating, you are keeping an eye on what does this mean in terms of the differential impacts on, for instance, the life of a woman farmer, a smallholder farmer, as opposed to just a lump sum that you might see from a program budgeting perspective, right? And then downstream, as you distribute, as you actually spend, you also keep in mind in terms of targeting, okay, that it is important that policy, marries closely with execution to the extent that you are able to pinpoint these are the smallholder farmers because they are the bottom of the chain, unfortunately, even though they produce a chunk of the food that we consume as Africa. Uh, that these smallholder farmers are not only have access to extension services in a special way because of the differential impacts that the food system has on them, but that also in terms of the distribution of inputs, right? Be it fertilizer, be it seeds and whatnot, so that they are very well targeted and protected, and doesn't, end, itself in the hands of, say, richer farmers, and so on and so forth. Part of that conversation has been, how do we ensure that when farmers such as those produce crops, that they're able to get a fair price, because that is the question of fairness which now comes into the picture, right? Beyond saying, well, the budget is only allocating 10%. However, now in distributing it, all these sorts of nuances must be woven into the conversation to ensure that we're able to build that value in a very equitable way, spread out. And that for us is the only way that we can deal with the inequalities within the question of, allocation and then spending. So yeah, this is very relevant, and these are some of the ways that we have tried really to engage uh, to ensure that fair prices are secured for smallholder farmers on their produce, to ensure that they are uniquely targeted as underprivileged within the value chain, underprivileged because of a systemic issue, and therefore we need to begin to arrest that systemic issue, to rein in that systemic issue with deliberate policy that enhances targeting, that enhances fair pricing, that enhances, access to markets for these minority farmers, and that is the important aspect of it.
So just to verify, Oxfam is the representation of those policies. So Oxfam really pushes for those policy reforms, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I start to have a better picture of how Oxfam attacks the value chain. So they try to really go to the root of the issue instead of going as from a reactive point of view. That's what I'm starting to see now.
Absolutely.
That makes
And
sense.
I think if you look at the way, the food system is, it's a whole value chain, right? And so uh even what a big company does in a rich country elsewhere uh has significant implications on a small holder farmer in
mm.
another country somewhere in Africa. And so, therefore, engaging that big behemoth, engaging that, huge architecture that has been laid out for decades, essentially to maintain poorer farmers to be subservient to a high value system that is exploited, by some rich company elsewhere, is the structural issue that we believe is central to the inequality conversation and connects different sectors of the economy beyond even food systems to extractives, so natural resources, and so on. And all of these are priorities that form part of our work. Yeah.
So, what would you say? How does Oxfam attack these policies right now? What are the gaps that are being, you know, what are the gaps that are still available at the moment? Because we're talking about this initiative, CAADP. It's been 20 years in the making and the play right now. So, are there heavy policy reform needs still going on? And the last part I think is more important is are these policy reforms attacked on a national level, or there's a way that they attack it, on a continental level?
It's been roughly 20 years and a few, I'll say, months
Yeah.
in the implementation of CAADP. Um, as I speak to you, a process has been launched really for a successor initiative. It should be launched sometime next year, early next year, in Kampala, and what they will call the Kampala Declaration, over the next 10 years, from 2026 to 2035. Um, Part of the recognition of that, uh, in the framing of that 10-year strategy, has been to ensure that you're looking at the agriculture sector, what they call now the agri-food systems space, in a way that is able to deal with the inequalities that exist. In the past, you're looking at more or less a blanket approach to it, but now recognizing that these realities are with us and they're even getting worse, that you have unequal value chains, that you have unequal funding and financing, and so on and so forth, that you have really low intra-African trade, as opposed to how it is in certain regions. For instance, Asia, which is roughly around 58% for Africa,
Hmm.
you're doubling around 15% of trading amongst ourselves. So all these realities are there. And um, the push has been to begin to strengthen efforts that stimulate trading internally, right, amongst ourselves, because it's one of the ways we can ensure that you are not only liberalizing a market, but also making sure that you're able to empower small and medium scale businesses, agribusinesses within the continent, so that if country A, for instance, say in Uganda, have produces coffee, it doesn't only head out to maybe um, a northern country, but uh, another country that consumes coffee should be able to buy that, okay, with very limited barriers in terms of imports and all of that. So all of these sorts of, efforts are central to it, okay, and personally, I'm excited that um, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, was launched years back, I think operational in 2021,
Yeah.
and has now started processes of these sorts of um, guided trade initiatives, to more or less pilot and see how it's working. That is one side of it. The other bit as well is to recognize that we have, a climate crisis on our hands, and therefore the need to centralize agroecology, the need to centralize farming systems that are able to not only create the yield that our smallholder farmers want, that the agriculture sector needs, but it's also able to be sustainable, to protect the environment, to generate and strengthen soil nutrients, to prevent erosion, and so on and so forth. So these kinds of practices, which I would like to call creating value through scaling impact, right? It's important, and it forms a critical component of what um, the new framework is looking at. The other aspect, in my view, is the focus on gender responsive, investments, because now that's where you begin to look at arresting the inequalities that exist within the food system. Okay, uh, that is also another aspect that I see is hugely reflected and would make an effort really towards um, enhancing a food system that works for everyone, a food system that uh, protects not just the sovereignty of farmers of countries, within the value chain, but is able to make sure that they're able to put food on the table um, for their families. Yeah.
So, do you feel how does Oxfam attack these policy reform initiatives? Do they do it with representatives within, let's say, for instance, Ghana has very different policies in the agricultural sectors compared to Nigeria or Ethiopia, and do they need representation to go and attack and push these policies on an individual level, or there's a way to do it much more efficiently?
What is important is to appreciate that governments can't do it alone, and therefore you need kind of an alliance. You need a kind of network, right, of different ideas, of different stakeholders, and that's the starting point. Currently, there's what we call um, the non-state actor group, right, which is set up as part of the CAADP process, and that brings together different farmer groups. It brings different stakeholders together to be able to sit down and discuss and forge ways to engage their governments, forge ways to engage the African Union on what is progressive food systems, what sort of food system would maintain and protect the sovereignty of countries, food system that would be able to protect indigenous farmer groups and so on and so forth. So these sorts of alliances exist and have been stimulating the discussions, the conversations on ways to rein in inequality, on ways to improve the food system. And that is the starting point. There is also what uh, we have been working with our stakeholders, our partners and allies on what we call the Africa Parliamentary, the Africa Food Systems Parliamentary Network, AFSPAN.
Okay.
AFSPAN basically brings together members of parliament from different countries, members of parliament who have significant interest, who have dedication and commitment towards uh, improving the food systems in their countries and, of course, across the continent, networked with such common plans and ideas to really push the food system beyond where it is right now. And that network uh, has really played a critical role in sort of advancing the current anchors of the 10-year strategy that we have in place. So, such a network, in my view, is really crucial um, to really help one, because of the power that they have as members of parliament to vote resources, as much resources at the national level in their national parliaments or assemblies, as others call it, to vote resources significantly into addressing the challenges of agriculture so that we're able to meet the target this time around. Because in the past, we really struggled because you had a situation where members of parliament were hardly even aware of what CAADP was, yet they were the ones who deliberate the budget discussions every year. So now you have such a network giving some recognition within the 10-year strategy uh, and working with non-state actor groups to really sort of push the agenda of food systems uh, through diverse ways. And I think that's one of the way to really arrest the crisis within the food system that we have. One critical thing for me is about evidence, and we have done that significantly, working to generate uh, research evidence that is strongly grounded, that is anchored in empirical evidence, right? That would help to shape current policy framing and to frame the debate in a different way towards the lens of inequalities, uh, towards the lens of protecting women farmers, towards the lens of guaranteeing ownership and control of land assets, and also making sure that we're able to stimulate that debate for such policy reforms to happen. And across the continent and beyond, we put out research evidence like this that will aid and guide decision makers and guide continental framers like the African Union to redirect the food system in the way that it should go.
There's something that is always mentioned about being proactive and being reactive, where we come with a plan to play catch up with the Western world, and because it's a plan to always catch up, we'll always be trying to catch up. What I mean is, when the landscape is changing, and maybe we're still trying to catch up to the previous structure, the previous landscape, then obviously we would have to catch up in the next phase. But still, many might argue that you still have to allow communities and countries to develop organically. We've seen it happen where we try to copy and paste the administration of the Westerners, and it's failing. Democracy hasn't been as it should be. But my question is, how do you see the technological advancement happening globally, affecting these reforms, these initiatives in Africa?
Obviously, we have to build in value. Tech is crucial, but also connected to that is the question of resources. And resources, I'm looking at it much more broadly. Resources to include both indigenous tech and capability. So I think it is important to really appreciate that, yes, technology is important and central to the conversation of food systems. Uh, but it's also important to acknowledge that there is local knowledge, there's indigenous knowledge, right, uh, across the food systems. And so recognizing all of these things also means that we're able to harvest the potential of these existing capabilities, right? And that spans several sectors. It could even be trade within the agricultural sector. It could be how we're able to adapt to the impacts of climate change, uh, which brings in the question of agroecology and in stating, as it were, farmer expertise that has been generated for centuries, right? Even outside of the existing technological landscape that we have. Recognizing that these are all potential instruments that can be deployed, you know, in in strengthening the food system, I think is very important because remember that nobody understands your backyard more than you, and so therefore, having tilled land for years, even though there are challenges around erratic rainfall and what have you, uh, understanding these practices that have been passed down year on year, centuries to century, is instrumental to starting that. The other bit which I would want to mention is also the need to protect, this indigenous knowledge, which is why I think currently under the AFCTA process, that's the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement processes, there's been discussion to launch a protocol around, indigenous knowledge, indigenous intellectual property rights, right? To be able to stimulate and sort of frame ways to protect these and to enhance them, down the line. There is in my view, the need for the budgets to also begin to look at pushing the boundaries of research, right? Because that is all part of innovation. That is all part of how we're able to to deploy tech that is context specific, technology that is able to adapt and respond to the needs of farmers in Africa, as opposed, for instance, to another region. And that starts with how the budget is able to do that, how resources should be voted in these kinds of processes to
Okay.
enhance its deployment. So it's two parts for me. One, recognizing indigenous knowledge and capabilities, and investing in processes that do not only protect them from depletion, from piracy, because corporates do engage in these sorts of piracy of genetic resources and what have you. That do not only protect these, but also helps to develop them. Then the other aspect is recognizing that there's newer technologies, and therefore, how do we uh, look closely into it, invest in it to stimulate context-specific deployment, in our food systems that is able to protect and stimulate productivity. Uh, could be through partnerships as well with uh, those who have that technology as well. Okay, to be able to stimulate its deployment at
Mm.
at at no cost to the sovereignty of the countries where you have this being deployed. And I think that is a critical caveat to add to this process. Yeah.
If we do still have a lot of smallholder farmers that are, unfairly compensated in this value chain, do you see the possibility of, a lot of workforce being, removed from this industry, this sector, with the mechanization of, agricultural industry? So I know that there's always been mechanization, but with more advancements, we see the entry point, the value, the expense to adopt these mechanized formulas and systems getting lower. So do you see that as a risk to to the current structure or the reforms happening?
There's always the high and the low of every intervention. But the critical thing to keep in mind is how well are you prepared, one, to navigate all of these things. Mechanization is extremely important, right? Because of the need, one, to be able to get work done more efficiently, to be able to till wider areas and be more intensive, right, in the way you deploy technology as well in the food systems. And so obviously you would have, for instance, a situation where uh, small base farmers that were probably uh, using smaller implements and what have you, potentially losing the space and the opportunity that they have to be able to thrive within the food system, because now you have, say, uh, a rise in AI, you
Okay.
have, say, a planter that is there to be used and so on. But the beauty of policy is such that it is able to build a kind of linkage between these two, ensuring that uh, smallholder farmers are able to receive the necessary training and capability enhancement uh, to integrate within a wider chain. That's one as a way to look at it, but also most importantly, to ensure that uh, they are not unfairly pushed out of such an ecosystem, right? If pushed out of the ecosystem, but there's got to be a way to ensure there's an uptick, of such groups in the broader food system to be able to maintain the value that we want. So I think it's looking at understanding the ups and downs of all of these technologies, what they mean, in terms of our educational system, how training should be ingrained, right? Both in the educational sector, but then also on the ground in terms of practice for those who are out of it in the informal space uh, to undertake these kinds of courses. And that's why extension services are important, really. But also to be able to get a pie, a slice of the pie, if I'll put it that way.
Okay, that makes sense. So, for example, I was gonna give a scenario. I've seen back in the days, poultry farmers. If you want to have maybe 5,000 birds, layer birds, for instance, you can imagine the amount of workforce that would entail. The people who pack the manure and everything. So you're giving employment to a good amount of people in that community. Now we see the automated poultry farms even being like widely adopted in Africa. So you can have 5,000 birds being managed by two, three people because it's fully automated. What I see with that is even though the capital to bring that is high, someone who can afford to invest that, they can put that, but now a farmer on the other side who is doing it his own old school way can't afford to produce anything close to that, and he can be beaten out in terms of price wars. So maybe I can reduce my price and sell more at more bulk to the wholesalers or retailers. So I'm just thinking how are these equalities going to be managed? What ways would be adopted? I'm assuming the Poultry Association will ensure there's a minimum sales price per egg or stuff like that. But I'm just curious how you see this being justified so everyone can get a slice of the pie.
Oftentimes, the real challenge that we are faced with uh, in the agribusiness space is that there's competition and there's profits conversation, right? Large companies want to make profit. That's actually and to maximize shareholder value. And that's why they are even existing. Smallholder farmers, uh, to a very large degree, is a survival conversation. So we need to make sure that this process is managed through carefully crafted policy to understand that it's not the overriding conversation is not competition free market conversation because these essentially are part of an existing structure that are designed really to keep anything small subservient to anything big. And that is where the danger arises from. So I think as Africa, if we are able to look closely at the role of policy, to say that we know we have, say, XX number of smallholder farmers, right? But there's also huge competition and value that you can generate from large scale businesses and so on, right? Let's just say the example of poultry that you've talked about. But how can we stimulate investments, right, in our smallholders to ensure that one, they understand the basics of the market, two, they understand, what sorts of tech they can deploy that is context specific. Number three, what sort of training, can they receive to be able to work their numbers and to deploy certain practices that are able to ensure that they also stimulate production, that they are not left out of the chain. So I think for me, the starting point is for us to really look closely into all of these nuances, understand the context of, competition, what, the inequalities have been and how can we arrest them. Because while someone might be seeing, you know, competition at its best, if you look at it closely, you're also seeing a structured layer that has been designed to perpetually keep people who are small in scale, who are small um, in the way they sort of produce, commodities and whatnot, is to sort of keep them out of the loop, which I think is where the challenge is. We need to begin to look at what the human economy is as opposed to um, what a non-human economy is, which is largely on GDP, basically. So that for me is the starting point. And if we do that, I think we wouldn't have to bother really about saying, well, um, you have these large scale businesses that are able to produce, say, 40,000 tons a year. But you have smallholder businesses, farmers that are able to produce maybe less than a ton. Okay. And that is a problem. I think it's about how do we make sure that we are giving them the necessary resources, we are giving them the necessary opportunities, we are giving them the necessary training to be able to thrive within the business models, within the farming system that they have, um, to challenge the existing, inequalities that we know are already existing in the space. So that, for me, would be a crucial lens to begin to look at uh, the food system space, um, whilst we support to grow that internally. Yeah.
So how do these people gain this? How do they get this access? Is it through the Oxfam websites? Are there bodies that are available for them? Because obviously I know Oxfam takes that proactive action to go find these people, but obviously to be more efficient and wide scale, there has to be a centralized place where people can get those help themselves as well. So how do they get access to these resources?
Is naturally something that you would find. For instance, if you uh, move from country to country, there are different initiatives that are in place, right? And this is government led, right? Different initiatives that are in place, one, to provide expert advice, to even sort of uh, help, smallholder farmers to access markets and what have you. You have quite a broad range of initiatives out there, and I'll say the starting point will be to look at what is happening in different countries and what is the context like, so that
Okay.
uh, farmers are able to really go and and access, such services, are able to go and get as much information. And in our own role as Oxfam and also other civil society, what we do is to put out information out there. As I had mentioned, the question of resources from research material and what have you, and then also to create the opportunity for minority groups, for smallholder farmers, to be able to access some platforms that are often a no-go, for
Okay.
them. So, for instance, if you take international platforms, if you take Africa level platform, what sort of opportunity is there for them to take part in those kinds of processes, both to understand the discourse that is happening on food systems globally, but also continentally, and what it means for their small farm in country A, B, C, D. So basically, these are the sorts of linkages that we provide, which is easier. But outside of that, at national level, there are quite lots of farmer resource centers that are there, but also driven through the regular farmer extension services that national governments provide to smallholder farmers.
I that's good. That's good. I'm just curious now. Let me say, if I put myself in the shoe of, a small farmer, let's say with maybe high school education in Mombasa, and he hasn't the context of, or I can find initiatives or something. What do you think would be the advice you can give that person to empower themselves to, at least leveling up to the best of their ability?
I'll say, first of all, to disregard the narrative that smallholder farmers don't mean anything. It's not everything that needs to be large scale. That is, for me, the entry point, right? For such a farmer to begin to recognize that they are part of the people who have made it possible for Africa to access up to 70% of its food supply. So that
Sure.
there's nothing more progressive than even knowing this, right? So that is the starting point. But beyond that is to also uh, take keen interest in the discourse on food systems, to engage, to build in true cooperatives that exist. Because as you work along with other networks, you are able to learn, but you are also have able to have a voice that you can reflect on your own needs and priorities. And that would be really crucial to building that value that we need from smallholder farms.
Do these cooperatives also gain access to not just government funds, but some of these international funds? Because we do hear that aids are being given all the time from international bodies and charities. But I'm just curious, where do they land in Africa, and how can these people get access to them directly?
That's true. You do have that, but as Oxfam, we recognize that in terms of official development assistance, there hasn't been the flow that is required, really,
Okay.
based on the commitments that rich countries have made in 1978. Rich countries made a commitment to invest up to 0.7% of their GNI, gross national income, into ODA. But our calculations as Oxfam, suggest that since then, what we currently have is at minimum $7 trillion that is owed for our
Mm,
countries. So
wow.
these have really not been coming out as they should. And it is important that richer countries are able to not just recommit, but to see this even as a floor and not as a ceiling. In other words, more needs to come in. And that also the decisions around how these flows should be prioritized need to be as representative as it should, which is why we are currently pushing along with broader civil society for such decisions to move from where they are right now, which is the OECD, to the UN system, because that is where we recognize that poorer countries are able to be represented, but also actually decide how well these kinds of flows should be applied uh, to meet the original intentions of aid, which is basically to reduce poverty. You know, so I think there's a whole lot of strands to consider around this conversation in terms of the flow, but also where it's supposed to be, is supposed to go, what should be its focus, who should be the instruments, and how should the governance of such instruments look like, so that at the end of the day, when such flows hit country A or B or C or D, they are touching the lives of poor people. And in the case of food systems, for instance, they're touching the lives of smallholder farmers to be able to access markets, to be able to access credit, to invest in their farming activities. Yeah.
Well, I do hope the future keeps shining brighter, because what you just mentioned, there are a lot of strands to consider there, and it seems like we might we could go deeper into that for hours, and we want to know more about those issues, like what does it take when someone disburses money and he realizes this money doesn't really get to those systems that was promised, but instead it's getting chokehold somewhere. It diminishes the motivation to actually keep disbursing that money in the first place. So yeah, there's a lot to discuss in that. But to round up though, we have a tradition where we want you to tell us what your vision is for a brighter Africa. So in your vision of an Africa in the next 10, 20 years, what do you imagine?
In the next 10, 20 years, that's quite a period. But I'll say that we're seeing an Africa that is basically driven by sunrise as opposed to sunset. Sunrise in the sense that all of the teething issues of conflicts, teething issues of hunger and poverty, the teething issues of inequality have reduced or are no more, and that the African is able to have control, is able to have access, is able to have make decisions, you know, around how to manage and transform their economies, transform value chains without losing the value that is currently losing, in the in the in this economic transformation agenda. Yeah. That's that's what I'll say would be.
Hopefully we get to see that day then. So well, thank you so much again, Francis, for your insightful analysis and your opinions on the general landscape of agriculture sector in Africa. I really do think for those who have more questions, I will assume how can they find more information? Because I've seen Oxfam have put out some really good research articles, but what else can people find more information?
Just the starting point would be to look at our website because you find lots of information there, but also to look out for lots of the reports that we are producing that are not necessarily on our website, but also on other platforms. And it's also easy to just walk into an Oxfam office that you find yourself nearby, and you could find as much information that you want to engage around these issues. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you once again, man. I hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you. And you too.
Yeah, have a good one.